The snow fell hard that morning in Dead Hollow, the kind that swallowed sound and erased tracks. It had been falling all night, but Colt McAllister still rode. Not because he wanted to, because he was paid to. The job was simple. Take the wrapped body to the forest's edge, dig a grave, and put her in it. The man who paid him said she was already gone. No family, no questions. Colt needed the money. His ranch was dying slower than his cattle, and pride didn't buy feed or boots anymore. So he took the job. By midday, he reached the grove, bare trees standing like mourners around a clearing blanketed in white. He slid from the saddle, shovel clinking as he pulled it loose. The bundled figure lay limp over the back of the horse, wrapped tight in thick gray wool. He didn't look at her face. He didn't need to. The stillness said enough. He dug for nearly an hour, the cold biting through his gloves, each strike of the shovel echoing into the forest. When the hole was waist deep, he turned back to the horse. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he muttered, more out of habit than heart. He eased the body down beside the grave and crouched to adjust the blanket. And that's when her eyes opened. Pale green, wide, blinking through frost. Colt stumbled back, falling into the snow with a curse caught in his throat. She didn't speak, didn't scream, just breathed, shallow and broken, but alive. "No," he whispered. "You're not supposed to—" He crawled to her, pressed two shaking fingers to her throat. A pulse, weak but there. Alive. Colt stared down at the woman he'd been paid to bury. And now, in the middle of nowhere, with snow falling and silence thick, he had a new problem. She wasn't dead, and someone clearly wanted her that way. Colt's heart hammered like hooves across frozen ground. She was alive. Not unconscious. Not dreaming. Alive. Her lips were blue, cracked. Her breath came shallow, like each one had to be argued with. But her eyes, those green eyes, locked onto his like she knew what almost happened. Colt pulled the blanket tighter around her trembling frame. "Don't talk," he muttered, more to steady himself than her. Just hold on." She blinked slowly. Then the corners of her mouth twitched. A whisper escaped, so soft it might have been wind. "Cold?" Colt gave a dry laugh, but it sounded too close to panic. "Yeah, that makes two of us." He couldn't stay there. The snow was still falling. Night wasn't far off. And whoever left this woman for dead hadn't bothered to make sure she stayed that way. He lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she was. Nothing but bones and secrets. He laid her across the saddle, mounted up behind her, and turned his horse toward home. By the time he reached his ranch, the sun had gone, and the horizon burned blue with dusk. The cabin wasn't much. Half-mended shutters, roof patched with whatever he could salvage. But it was dry, and it was warm. He kicked the door open with his boot, brought her in, and laid her on his cot. His hands moved on their own. Firewood, blankets, a kettle over the flames. She didn't say a word. Didn't even ask where she was. She just stared at him like he was the only thing holding her in this world. An hour passed before she spoke again. "Name?" she rasped. Colt leaned in. "What?" She licked her lips, barely. "Do you have one?" He nodded slowly. "Colt." Her eyes fluttered, then closed. But not before she whispered, "Don't let them find me." Colt sat by the fire all night, boots still on, rifle across his lap. He didn't know who they were, but he had a feeling he was about to find out. By morning, the storm had moved east, leaving behind a quiet hush and a thick white blanket over the world. Inside the cabin, the woman still hadn't said much, but her color had come back slightly, and she sipped broth like she remembered how hunger worked. Colt watched her from across the room, more guarded than curious. Finally, she set the cup down and looked at him. "You dig graves often?" He froze. "No," he said flatly. She nodded. "Good. You're not very good at it." Colt raised an eyebrow. "Want me to finish the job properly?" A faint smirk tugged at her lips. Might have been easier. He folded his arms. "Might have been cleaner, too." There was a pause. Then she said, almost too casually, "You didn't ask my name." Colt glanced at her. "Didn't seem like you were in a hurry to give it." "I'm not." "Then we're square." She studied him. Most men wanted to fix things, or ask questions, or own the story. But Colt? He just gave her a fire and didn't demand anything in return. That made him dangerous in a different kind of way. By noon, she tried to stand and nearly collapsed. Colt caught her before she hit the floor. "Easy," he muttered. "You're not stitched together just yet." She leaned on him longer than she needed to. Not for drama, but for warmth. "I have to leave soon," she whispered. "They'll be looking." "You said that already." "And I meant it." Colt helped her back to the cot and turned to check the fire. "You got a name, or should I keep calling you her?" A pause. Then, "Josie." He didn't turn. "Short for something?" "No." That night, Colt stepped outside, rifle over his shoulder, scanning the tree line like it might blink first. Wolves howled in the distance, but he knew better. The real predators wore boots and carried papers, and someone had paid good money to bury a woman who refused to stay buried. Inside, Josie lay awake, eyes on the ceiling, breath shallow. She didn't know who Colt really was, but he hadn't turned her in. And for now, that was more than she'd had in a long, long time. Colt didn't sleep much that night. The wind creaked through the old cabin boards, and every sound made him think of hooves or boots outside. He kept his rifle propped beside the door. Josie lay quiet, but not peacefully. Her breaths were clipped, like even in rest, she was listening for danger. Just before dawn, Colt heard her speak. "You don't ask a lot of questions." He looked over, surprised she was awake. "Wasn't paid to talk," he said. A shadow flickered across her face. "Was paid to bury me, though." He nodded once. "But you didn't." "I'm not good at following bad orders." Josie sat up, hair a tangle of golden dirt, and looked at him. "You know they'll come looking. I'm not unimportant." Colt stared at her. "So what are you?" She hesitated. "The sheriff's wife," she said slowly. "Or I was." That explained the expensive dress, the clean nails, the kind of anger that felt like betrayal. "What happened?" Colt asked, voice low. Josie met his eyes. "He thought I was a secret he could keep. I became one he couldn't kill." Later that morning, Colt saddled his horse. "You're taking me back?" Josie asked, stiffening by the fire. He tossed her a coat. "No." "Then where?" "Town's too close. I got a place out in the hills. Abandoned line shack. No one will think to look there." Josie clutched the coat. "Why help me?" He paused. "Because you opened your eyes." As they rode through the cold morning light, the land stretched out wide and wild around them. Josie stayed close behind, her thoughts loud in the silence. Every hoofbeat was another second borrowed, another second they hadn't found her. And riding ahead, Colt wasn't sure who he was helping more, her, or the part of himself that still believed some lives deserved a second chance. The shack wasn't much, just 4 splintered walls, a rusted stovepipe, and a door that moaned like it hadn't been opened in years. But it stood high above the valley, where no lawman rode unless they were lost or desperate. Colt pushed the door open with his shoulder. "This is it." Josie looked around with wary eyes. "You brought me to a ghost." Colt shrugged. "Ghosts don't talk, and they don't bleed." She walked in slowly, her feet dragging across the warped floorboards. "Better than 6 feet under," she muttered. He got the stove going with some dry pine he'd stashed weeks ago. While the fire struggled to catch, Josie sat huddled in an old quilt Colt found stuffed under the cot. "You really think I'll be safe here?" she asked. "No," Colt said honestly. "But I think you'll be forgotten. And sometimes, that's safer than being found." Her lips twisted into a bitter smile. "You speak like someone who's done some forgetting himself." Colt didn't answer. That night a storm blew in from the mountains. The wind howled against the shack like it wanted to tear it down, but inside, the fire held. Josie curled closer to it, the orange light dancing in her eyes. "Tell me something true, Colt," she whispered. He looked up from where he was fixing a cracked boot sole. "I used to think if you did the right thing long enough, life would stop hitting you in the teeth." Josie chuckled quietly. "That sounds like something a man who's missing teeth would say." He grinned despite himself. For the first time in years, Colt felt the cold not biting so deep. Not because the stove burned hotter, but because, across the room, someone who should have been dead was alive, and she was laughing in the face of ghosts. And maybe, just maybe, that meant he could start believing in life again, too. The morning came gray and cold. Colt stepped outside to check the traps he'd set weeks back. Rabbits, mostly, enough to keep hunger off their backs. He returned with 2 and skinned them at the creek before Josie stirred from the cot. Inside, she sat up slowly, blinking like she didn't quite remember where she was. "You're still here," she said. Colt set the rabbits in the pot over the fire. "Didn't have anywhere else to be." Josie looked at him for a long moment. "I think I remember who tried to kill me." He sat still, the knife still in his hand. Josie rubbed her temple. "It's hazy, but I remember the scent of kerosene, and the way someone whispered my name before hitting me. Someone who knew me." Colt's eyes narrowed. "A man?" She nodded. "I don't remember his face, but I know he was angry. Like I'd betrayed him." Colt stirred the pot slowly. "Sounds personal." It was. She wouldn't say more. Not yet. But the firelight caught something in her eyes. Fear mixed with guilt. That afternoon she took her first steps outside the shack. The wind combed through her tangled hair, and she closed her eyes against the brightness of the world. "I thought I was dead," she said softly. "I thought no one would find me." "You were half right," Josie smiled. "And you? What were you before you found me?" Colt didn't answer, because the truth was, He'd been nothing more than a broken man with a shovel. That night, after stew and silence, Josie finally spoke again. His name was Elijah, my husband's brother. After Daniel died, he wanted me to stay, to marry him, keep the land and the family. Colt looked up. But I refused, Josie continued, voice trembling. He said I was ungrateful, that I didn't know what survival meant out here. And then? Josie met Colt's eyes. Then he put a sack over my head, and the world went black. The crackling fire was the only sound between them after Josie's confession. Elijah. A name Colt had heard in passing but never tied to anything dark. The thought of a man doing that to kin, especially to a woman mourning her husband, set his jaw tight. You ever think about telling the sheriff? Colt asked finally. Josie shook her head. Elijah is the sheriff. At least he was. After Daniel died, he took over everything. The ranch, the badge, the town's trust. Colt stared into the flames. That changed everything. For days, Josie stayed close to the cabin, slowly regaining strength. Colt brought her fresh water and what little food he could scavenge. She learned to move again, to breathe without shaking, but always that fear lingered. What if Elijah found out she was alive? Colt reinforced the cabin door, boarded up the side window, cleaned his rifle. You sure you want to stay here? He asked one morning as snow threatened the horizon. Josie stood in the doorway, arms folded. No one else is going to help me clear my name. One afternoon, Colt rode into the edge of the nearest town under the guise of trading fur. He kept his head down at the general store, ears wide open. Elijah says winter will hit harder than usual, the clerk muttered. Elijah says this. Elijah says that, someone else replied. You'd think he owned the sky. Colt kept his eyes fixed on the shelves. But it was the old man by the pot-belly stove who whispered something that chilled him. You hear about that widow of Daniel's? The old man rasped. Some say she went missing. Others say Elijah buried her somewhere no one will ever find. Colt clenched his fists. They'd already buried her once. They weren't doing it again. Back at the cabin, Josie was waiting with a letter in hand. I wrote this the night before I disappeared, she said quietly. I meant for it to go to the marshal in Jackson, but Elijah must have intercepted it. She handed it to Colt. It was sealed, addressed, but never sent. This might be our only proof, she whispered. Colt looked at the letter, then at the woman before him, battered but unbroken. You sure you're ready to do this? Josie didn't hesitate. I'm done hiding. Colt rode through the biting wind, Josie's letter tucked safely in his coat. The journey to Jackson would take 2 days. Dangerous country, with ice-glazed ridges and wolves that stalked travelers who smelled of weakness. But Colt had made a promise, not just to Josie, but to the part of himself that still believed in justice. When he reached the outpost, the marshal was skeptical at first. A woman coming back from the grave with a letter? The man muttered, adjusting his hat. Colt pulled the envelope from his coat, laid it on the desk. Read it, then tell me if she's lying. While the marshal read, Colt paced. Inside the envelope was Josie's handwriting, steady and raw. She had written every threat Elijah made, every insult, every slap. She wrote of the night she found her husband's journal, notes about land deals Elijah made behind Daniel's back, how he manipulated local councilmen. Then suddenly, Daniel died in a hunting accident. Josie never believed it, and when she spoke up, Elijah silenced her, almost permanently. The marshal looked up slowly, his weathered face hardening. If what she says is true, he said, your town's been living under a badge that don't belong to him. Colt leaned forward. So what are you gonna do? The marshal folded the letter, slid it into his coat. I'm gonna ride with you. And if she's alive, if she signs this in front of me, I'll bring him in myself. Colt exhaled for the first time in hours. They left before the snow got worse. Back at the cabin, Josie sat with a loaded revolver resting on the table. She hadn't needed it yet. But the closer justice got, the more she feared Elijah would feel the noose tightening. When the door opened and Colt stepped through, with the marshal behind him, Josie rose to her feet. You came, she said softly. The marshal tipped his hat. Only one question, ma'am. You still stand by the words in this letter? Josie met his eyes without flinching. I do. He nodded. Then let's end this. Word spread fast. By the time Colt, Josie, and the marshal rode back into Jasper's Hollow, the air was thick with whispers. Folks peeked from behind curtains. The saloon emptied as cowboys stepped into the street. Children clutched their mothers' skirts. It wasn't every day that a woman presumed dead rode into town beside the law. Josie sat tall on her horse. Though her frame was still healing, her spine was steel. Elijah stood on the sheriff's porch, arms crossed, eyes narrow. He was already watching them. The marshal dismounted first, Elijah Mathers, he called out. I got a signed statement here. Accusations of fraud, coercion, and attempted murder. Elijah laughed dryly, glancing at the townsfolk gathering behind him. Based on what, a ghost tale? Then Josie dismounted, and the street went still. Every eye turned to her. She stepped forward, voice steady. You tried to bury me, Elijah. But truth doesn't stay buried long. The marshal held out the letter for the town to see. She wrote this with her own hand. I saw her sign it myself. Elijah stepped back slightly, but then snapped. You think they'll believe her? She's always been unstable. But Josie didn't flinch. She pulled a small locket from around her neck and opened it. Inside were 2 photographs, one of her and Daniel, and the other, a copy of the journal page. The one Elijah had burned, but not before Josie photographed it in secret. The townsfolk murmured. The blacksmith stepped forward, squinting. I remember Daniel writing about that deal, said it felt off. Others chimed in. The truth had always been there, buried beneath fear and silence. The marshal turned to Elijah. You're under arrest. Elijah lunged. A hand went to his belt, but Colt was faster. One shot rang out. A bullet struck the ground by Elijah's boot. Don't, Colt warned. Don't make this uglier than it already is. Elijah froze. The marshal clamped irons around his wrists. As Elijah was dragged away, the crowd stood motionless, until someone started clapping. Then another. And another. Not for the arrest, but for Josie, for surviving, for standing up, for finally bringing the storm to an end. Colt looked over at her, and for the first time since this began, she smiled. Not in pain, but in peace. The jail cell door clanged shut on Elijah, and the sound echoed through Jasper's Hollow like a closing chapter. Josie watched it happen from across the street, Colt standing silently beside her. She wasn't trembling anymore. Her hands were steady, her shoulders no longer burdened by fear. But now came the question, what next? That evening, the marshal prepared to ride out with Elijah in tow, headed for the county courthouse. The town gathered again, this time not out of curiosity but respect. Don't let him out on sweet words, someone murmured. Too many good folks buried for what he's done, another said. Josie gave a simple nod of thanks to those who approached, but she kept close to Colt. The day had been long, and her wounds, both the ones on her skin and the ones beneath, hadn't fully healed. Yet her eyes were clear, clearer than they'd ever been. Colt walked her back to the modest cabin at the edge of the meadow, the place he'd offered, never expecting her to stay. The fire was already lit inside, warm and gentle. As she sat down, she looked around the space that had become her sanctuary. I never thought I'd get here, she whispered. Colt crouched beside her. And I never thought a woman in a pine box would change everything. She laughed, softly, painfully, but real. I owe you. No, he said. You owe yourself. I just stood in the way of the shovels. Days passed. The town began to settle again. But Josie didn't fade from memory. The general store offered her credit without asking. The schoolmarm brought over bread. The blacksmith stopped by with a repaired gate latch and refused payment. It wasn't charity. It was redemption. Colt resumed work on his ranch. But Josie wasn't content to rest in a rocking chair. She offered to help. Fix fences, milk cows, ride the outer line to check for coyotes. And slowly they began building something. Not just fences and pens, but trust, friendship, something that didn't need a name yet. One night, as the stars glittered and the silence stretched, Josie asked, Do you think love comes back from the dead? Colt thought a long moment. Then he answered, I think love never dies. Sometimes it just waits for us to be strong enough to let it in again. She turned her head. Their eyes met. She didn't look away, and neither did he. The spring thaw came late that year. Snow still clung to the hills like stubborn memories, but down in the valley, green shoots were pushing through the frozen earth. Life, stubborn and defiant, refused to give up, just like Josie. Each morning, she rose before the sun, wrapped in Colt's too-big coat, and stepped outside to feel the frost underfoot. The cold reminded her she was alive. The sunrise reminded her she had a future. Colt met her at the fence line every morning, a mug of coffee in each hand. No words, just presence, just warmth. Their lives had fallen into rhythm, calm, strong, healing. The cabin walls echoed with silence that wasn't lonely, the silence of trust. Then, one afternoon, Josie came back from the general store with something tucked under her coat. Colt raised an eyebrow. You robbed the place? She grinned. Something like that. She pulled out a thick leather-bound journal. I figured, maybe it's time I start writing again, telling stories that aren't haunted. He nodded, then added softly, or maybe tell the ones that are, and finish them right. That night she wrote by lantern light. About a man with calloused hands and quiet eyes, about second chances, about how sometimes the world doesn't save you. You save yourself, with someone just steady enough to stand beside you. A month later, Josie rode into town with Colt beside her. Elijah had been sentenced. Justice had spoken, and for once, it had spoken true. The weight in her chest wasn't gone, but it was lighter, bearable. In front of the old church, the preacher looked at her with kind surprise. "Back so soon, Josie?" She smiled. "Not for a sermon, for a beginning." That evening, Colt took her hand by the fireplace. "I don't want to push you," he said. "But if ever there's a day you stop surviving and start wanting more, I'd like to be part of it." She looked at him. "Colt," she said, "I think that day's already come." He didn't kiss her then. Not yet. He just sat beside her as the fire burned low. Two people who'd lost too much, but not everything, because some things once found don't get lost again. Not in a town like Jasper's Hollow, and not in a love like theirs. The days grew longer. The warmth of spring rolled gently over Jasper's Hollow like a blanket of hope, stirring life back into the soil and into hearts once hardened by loss. Josie stood at the edge of the pasture, watching the horses graze. One of them, a mare she'd helped nurse back to health, lifted its head and snorted, as if sensing her thoughts. Behind her, Colt approached with a small wooden box in his hands. "Found this in the barn," he said, offering it to her. "Used to belong to my mother." Josie opened it carefully. Inside was a delicate hair comb carved from bone and inlaid with faded turquoise. "It's beautiful. She wore it the day she married my father. Said it reminded her that no matter how rough the land was, beauty could take root." Josie traced the comb's edges, eyes softening. "You want me to wear it?" He nodded, then hesitated. "I want you to wear it when you're ready, if you're ever ready." The conversation hung between them like the dust motes in the golden evening light. Later that night, as the wind sighed through the cabin's chinks, Josie sat by the window, the comb on her lap. She thought of everything that had brought her here, of the life stolen, and the one that had grown in its place. She wasn't whole yet, but she was no longer broken in the same way. The next morning, when Colt came in from chopping wood, he found her at the stove, humming softly, her hair pinned up with the comb. He said nothing, but the look on his face of awe, of gratitude, of love said everything. That evening they walked through town together. No hiding, no fear. People stopped and watched. The widow who'd risen from the grave, the rancher who'd saved her. Their story had become a quiet legend whispered on porches and across counters, not a tale of sorrow, but of mercy, of courage, of something stronger than revenge, of love. And as they passed the empty auction yard, Josie paused. "That day when I was laying in the earth, I heard something," she said quietly. "It wasn't a voice, just a knowing that someone wasn't ready to give up on me." Colt took her hand. "I was ready to bury you, Josie, but something stopped me." "You?" "No," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You stopped me." As spring gave way to summer, the town of Dry Creek began to hum again. The general store was busier. Children ran barefoot through dusty lanes, and rumors spread like wildfire, but none as enduring as the one about the rancher who didn't bury the woman he was paid to. Some called it a miracle, others superstition. But those who'd met Josie and seen the quiet fire in her eyes knew better. Sheriff Danner stopped Colt one morning outside the blacksmith's. "Got word from Carson's Ridge. They want you to come tell your story at their fair. Reckon folks could use a little hope." Colt frowned. "I'm no storyteller." The sheriff gave a small smirk. "You're living one, son." Back at the ranch, Josie was teaching a young girl, Emma, the orphan from town, how to saddle a horse. She and Colt had taken her in, not out of charity, but instinct. Emma needed a home. Josie needed to give the care she once begged for. And Colt needed to see healing happen with his own eyes. "Why don't you tell it?" Colt said that night over dinner. "Tell what?" "Our story at Carson's Ridge." Josie paused, then smiled gently. "Because it's not finished yet." And it wasn't. There were still wounds inside her. Ghosts that came in dreams, memories she hadn't shared even with Colt. But each day, with his kindness, with Emma's laughter, with the land under her boots, those shadows grew a little softer. The townspeople, once skeptical, began to embrace her. They brought bread, asked her advice, treated her as more than a survivor, as one of their own. And at church one Sunday, an old woman approached her. "You walked through the valley of death, child, but you came back with something precious." Josie blinked. "What's that?" "Truth." She glanced at Colt across the aisle. Emma sat between them, clutching her hand. "Yes, truth. Not that life was fair, not that pain could be erased, But that love, raw, unpolished love, could be enough to build again. And Josie was ready to build, even if it began with nothing more than a home, a child, and a man who once held a shovel in trembling hands, and instead chose mercy. The days grew warmer, and with each passing one, Josie felt the weight of the past gradually lift. She no longer woke in the middle of the night to the sound of a shovel digging into the earth, or the ghostly memory of her own funeral. It seemed that her mind was slowly finding peace, or at least she told herself it was. But one evening, just as the sun dipped behind the mountains, a horse's silhouette appeared on the horizon. Colt had been away all day, and the ranch had been eerily quiet, except for the rustling of the wind through the tall grass. Josie stood at the gate, squinting against the setting sun. The rider's shape grew clearer. She felt a flicker of dread. Her heart raced for a moment. Could it be? Could it be someone from her past? But as the rider drew closer, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just anyone. It was Frank Cartwright, a man who had once called himself her fiancé, a man she had been forced to leave behind in another life, in another world. Her pulse quickened. She turned, looking for the nearest escape, but the gate was still open, and there was no turning back now. The man was close, close enough that she could hear the clip-clop of his horse's hooves against the dirt road. "Josie," Frank's voice called out. It was rough, gruff, yet strangely tender. He had always been that way, and that was how she remembered him. She held her ground. "What do you want, Frank?" He pulled his horse to a stop just a few feet away from her, looking down at her with a mixture of regret and longing. "I came to apologize." Josie felt a lump form in her throat, but she stood tall. "Apologize? For what? For abandoning me? For leaving me to die in that house?" He winced at her words but didn't shy away. "I was a coward. I thought I could build a life for us, and I couldn't. I failed you, Josie. I failed us both." Her fingers tightened on the gate, the anger rising in her chest. "You failed me?" "No, Frank, you didn't fail me. You killed everything I loved. You left me to rot in the dirt. And now you want to apologize?" The silence between them grew thick. Her words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and charged. "Josie, please," Frank said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "I know what I did was unforgivable, but I came back to make things right. I came back for you." The tension between them simmered, but before Josie could speak again, she heard Colt's voice from behind her. "Is everything all right here?" Josie turned to find Colt walking towards her, his eyes narrowing when he saw the man standing at the gate. His protective instincts flared, but he said nothing yet. "This is Frank Cartwright," Josie said coldly, stepping away from the gate. "He's someone from my past." Colt's eyes met Josie's, a silent question passing between them. He didn't need to ask. He already knew the pain that man had caused her. He didn't need to know more than that. "I'm here to make amends," Frank said, his voice tinged with the slightest hesitation. Colt nodded, his gaze never leaving Frank's. "We don't need your kind of apology here." His voice was low, but the anger in it was unmistakable. Frank swallowed hard, then turned his horse, ready to leave without another word. As he rode away, Josie's heart pounded in her chest, not from fear but from relief. It was over. He was gone, and the shackles of the past were breaking, piece by piece. But as the sun dipped lower, Colt didn't move. He simply stood next to her, his presence a steady comfort. "You don't have to worry about him anymore, Josie," Colt said quietly, his voice unwavering. "You have a family now. You have us." Josie looked up at him, her heart swelling with gratitude and love. "I know, Colt, and I'm grateful. Every day." The rest of the evening was peaceful. They worked together, mending the fence that had fallen into disrepair over the past few months. The air felt lighter now, as though something heavy had been lifted. And as the moon rose above the plains, Josie finally allowed herself to smile. For the first time in a long while, Josie felt the weight of the past truly beginning to fade. She had found a home, a new family, and a man who had never wavered in his kindness. And as Colt reached for her hand under the stars, she realized that, for the first time in a long time, she was exactly where she needed to be. The next morning after Frank's unexpected visit, Josie awoke before the sun. The sky was still pale and quiet, and the ranch lay beneath a blanket of fog. She sat on the edge of her bed, watching the light filter through the curtains, a heavy stillness in her chest. Last night had stirred more than just memories. It stirred choices, deep ones, painful ones. She stepped outside with a shawl draped around her shoulders. The dew was thick on the ground and the horses hadn't yet stirred in the corral. But Colt was already out by the barn, his tall figure moving slowly, methodically, checking fence lines. Just like always. Steady, reliable, kind. When he saw her approaching, he gave a soft smile. Didn't expect to see you up this early. Couldn't sleep, Josie admitted, tucking her hands into her shawl. Last night was heavy. Colt nodded, leaning on the fence. He won't be coming back, I made that clear. I know, she said. Then, after a pause, but I needed to see him. One last time, to close that door. Colt looked away for a second, then back at her. Did you? Josie took a breath, eyes fixed on the distant horizon. Yes. And when I saw him, I felt nothing but cold. No love. No longing. Just a shadow of the girl I used to be. She turned toward Colt, voice steadier. I want something else now. Something real. Not built on promises that vanish when times get hard. His jaw tensed slightly as if he'd been holding his breath. And what is it you want, Josie? She reached forward and touched his hand, rough from work and sun. You. This place. Us. Colt didn't speak, just pulled her in slowly, wrapping his arms around her. There, under the morning mist, the silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of warmth, of trust, of a quiet kind of love that grew not from fire, but from roots. As spring rolled into early summer, the ranch transformed. Josie no longer moved like a woman with something to fear. She laughed more. She sang when cooking, and sometimes danced barefoot in the field with the little ones who visited from neighboring homesteads. Colt built a small swing for the porch, and together they began mending not only fences but pieces of each other. One afternoon, they visited the old part of town, where Frank once lived. His place had been sold off, and no trace of him remained. In its place, they saw a traveling teacher setting up a school for orphans. Josie smiled as children chased each other barefoot in the dust. Funny how things come around, she said. Sometimes you have to lose everything, Colt replied, to know what actually matters. They returned home in time to catch the sun dipping below the hills. Josie sat beside Colt on the porch steps, sipping sweet tea, her head resting on his shoulder. What would you have done, she asked quietly, if I'd never opened my eyes that day? He looked down at her, his voice low. Buried my heart with you, Josie. She took his hand and squeezed it gently. Then I'm glad I opened them for the both of us. The ranch had always been a place of labor for Colt. Dirt, sweat, and the weight of responsibility pressed into every post and beam. But now, as summer's gold began to ripen the fields, and Josie's laughter floated across the property like wind chimes in a breeze, something had shifted. It had become a home. One morning, as the sun painted the sky in dusty amber, Josie rode out with Colt to check the northern pasture. The horses moved in unison, comfortable, as if they too sensed the peace settling into their riders. Colt, she said softly, her fingers brushing the mane of her mare, what would you say if I wanted to plant apple trees by the fence? He tilted his head with a grin. I'd say you better pick a strong spot. Those roots run deep. She smiled. That's the point. After all the wandering, all the grief, Josie had chosen to put down roots of her own. Later that week they held a gathering, a modest one with neighbors and friends. Colt grilled meat over an open flame, and Josie made her famous peach cobbler from scratch. Music drifted from a fiddle as children ran through the yard, and lanterns flickered like fireflies as night fell. People had noticed the change in Josie. She's not the same woman we saw 6 months ago, whispered a neighbor's wife. No, her husband agreed, sipping whiskey. She's better. That night, after the last wagon rolled away and the candles burned low, Josie stood barefoot on the porch and looked out at the land. Colt stepped beside her. You tired? She shook her head. Just full of everything. A breeze rustled her hair, and he wrapped his arm around her waist. I never thought I'd love again, Colt. Never thought I'd live like this. He leaned down, his voice gravel and honey. And I never thought I'd be the man who got to witness it. In the weeks that followed, the ranch continued to thrive. Josie started taking in orphans from nearby towns, just a few at first. Children who reminded her of herself. Lost, scared, needing a second chance. She taught them to ride, to bake, to trust. And Colt built bunk houses and carved rocking horses in the barn. Together they created more than a home. They created a haven. One evening, as summer slipped into fall, Josie sat on the porch swing with a journal in her lap. She had written 3 words at the top of the page. This is home. Then she paused and added, this is love. And finally, this is the life I almost never lived. She closed the book, leaned into Colt's shoulder and whispered, thank you for waiting. Thank you for digging. Just deep enough to let me breathe again. Colt didn't reply. He didn't need to. He just held her hand, tight, steady, and forever. The first frost came early that year. It crept across the windows in the dark hours of morning, tracing cold feathers along the glass. Josie awoke before dawn with a strange ache in her chest. Not pain exactly. More like the ghost of something unfinished. While Colt still slept, she rose quietly and lit the fireplace downstairs. The house had become a rhythm. Creaking floors, the smell of ash and old pine, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the parlor. But today something felt different. She reached into an old wooden box she kept tucked beneath the floorboards, the same box that had followed her across counties and territories. Inside, nestled among brittle memories, lay a sealed letter. The handwriting was hers, but shakier, almost panicked. She had written it weeks before Colt found her buried under snow and silence. It was a goodbye, a confession, and a promise not to haunt anyone with the memory of a woman too broken to fix. Josie stood by the fire, holding the letter in trembling hands. She could toss it into the flames and never speak of it again. She could erase the woman who once scribbled those words in despair. But something stopped her. Instead, she folded the letter back into its envelope, carried it outside, and walked beyond the barn, past the corral, past the apple fence, until she reached the stone marker Colt had placed that spring, a simple slab that read, Josie, found, loved, alive. She placed the letter beneath a stone at its base. I'm not that woman anymore, she whispered, voice thick with tears and frost. But I'll never forget her. That afternoon, Colt noticed something different in Josie's eyes. Not sadness, but release. She didn't say anything. She just grabbed his hand in the barn, pulled him into a kiss full of autumn fire, and smiled like the world had finally stopped spinning too fast. What was that for? He asked, breathless. For not giving up, she said, even when I had. That winter, as snow fell again across the plains, Colt and Josie opened the ranch's doors wider than ever. Children came, drifters came, even old friends who thought they were forgotten. And above the fireplace, on a plaque Josie carved herself, hung the words, buried once, raised forever. Because love didn't just save her, it made her whole. Snow blanketed the ranch in silence, the kind of hush that made every hoofbeat and heartbeat feel sacred. It was nearing Christmas, though calendars hardly mattered here. Only the feel of the wind and the smell of pine determined the season. Josie and Colt had made it a tradition to keep the barn open for those in need. Orphans, widows, men lost between towns and time. No one was turned away. One morning, two riders approached slowly across the snowy field. One older, the other barely a teenager. The boy's face was hidden beneath a scarf, but his posture was familiar, guarded but yearning. Josie stepped outside, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. We don't charge for warmth, she said gently, but we do ask for your name. The older man dismounted stiffly. Name's Reverend Daniel Hart, he said, brushing snow off his coat. This here's my ward, Silas. He don't speak much. Josie's eyes narrowed. Silas, huh? The boy flinched as if the name was a wound. Colt joined her at the door, boots crunching through frost. Come in, he said without question. You're just in time. Josie makes a stew so good it can turn regrets into blessings. Inside, Silas refused to meet anyone's eyes. But he watched everything. Josie's quiet grace, Colt's gentle humor, even the old dog sleeping by the hearth. And later that night, when the fire was low and the others had gone to bed, Josie found the boy sitting alone in the kitchen, staring at a wooden carving of a bird hanging on the wall. I used to be buried too, she said, pouring 2 mugs of tea. Not under dirt, but under shame, silence, and the lie that no one cared. He looked up, eyes wide. Then how did you get out? I didn't, she answered. Someone reached in and pulled me back. She didn't ask what Silas had seen, or what had happened to his parents. She didn't need to. Instead, she pulled a quilt off the back of the chair and wrapped it around his shoulders. You're not alone anymore, she whispered. The next morning, the boy was already outside, helping Colt mend the fence. No one mentioned the scar on his wrist or the bruise on his ribs. Only the way he laughed when the dog knocked him over chasing a stick. And for the first time in what might have been years, Josie heard music in the house again, faint humming from the boy, echoing down the hallway. Redemption didn't need to shout. Sometimes it only needed a place to land. The days grew longer, and with them, the list of repairs around the ranch. Winter had been unforgiving, but spring returned like an old friend, slow, warm, and kind. The snow melted into the soil, coaxing green from brown. Calves were born, fences mended, and laughter became as common as birdsong at dawn. Silas, once a quiet shadow on the porch, now raced through the yard with muddy boots and sun on his face. He still flinched at loud voices, still froze when someone approached too quickly, but each day he stayed longer in the light. One afternoon, as Colt taught the boy how to saddle a restless mare, Josie stood on the porch steps with a piece of carved wood in her hands. It was a nameplate, Silas, etched in firm letters, polished smooth and warm. She walked toward him slowly, handing it over like it was something sacred. "You don't have to hang it unless you want to," she said. "But I thought maybe you'd like your own space in the bunkhouse, with your name on the door." Silas stared at it for a long time. Then, with a trembling breath, he looked up and asked, "Can I hang it outside your house instead?" Colt's jaw clenched and Josie's heart swelled. "You sure, kid?" Colt asked, voice thick. Silas nodded. "I want to be where you are. Feels safe." Josie knelt down to his level, brushing a lock of hair from his brow. "Then that nameplate belongs exactly where you said." That evening, under a sky of burnished gold and purple, Colt and Silas hammered the little sign beside the front door. The tap of the hammer was gentle, deliberate. With every strike, the sound echoed not just in the wood, but through years of silence the boy had carried in his chest. And when Josie lit the lantern that night, its glow illuminated 3 names above the porch: Colt, Josie, Silas. The town noticed. Whispers moved through the saloon, through the church, through the schoolhouse. That boy's living with the woman who rose from the grave. The rancher who once never spoke now smiles when he talks about a family. But for the first time in a long while, Josie didn't care what people said. The wind could carry their stories wherever it wanted. This story, her story, was being written by their hands, not someone else's rumors. And in that quiet home, nestled between broken hills and stubborn hope, a family was stitching itself back together. One warm meal, one scarred soul, one gentle word at a time. The morning fog settled heavy over the valley, quieting even the cattle. Josie was stirring coffee when Colt spotted the rider, a lone figure on a chestnut mare, moving slow, like he wasn't sure whether he belonged here. Colt stepped off the porch, hat low, hand resting near the handle of his belt. Not a threat. Not yet. But ready. The rider stopped 10 paces away. His face was weathered, with a scar that curved just under his left eye. But the eyes, those were the same green as Josie's, only colder, older. "Been a long time," the man said. "You look just like Ma." Josie came out, coffee in hand. Her eyes widened. She took 2 steps forward, then stopped, heart pounding. "Micah?" He nodded. Didn't know where else to go. Micah Stone, her brother, had vanished years ago, just before her wedding. Rumor said he'd robbed a card table in Amarillo, that he'd killed a man in a duel gone wrong. Josie had buried the grief with her parents. She never thought she'd see him again. Now here he was, dusty, bruised, and riding a horse that looked more bones than hide. They fed him, let him bathe, gave him the guest cot in the barn. But that night, Colt whispered, "We don't know what he's run from. Just 'cause he's blood doesn't mean he's clean." Josie nodded. "I know, but he was my brother long before he was a stranger." Micah kept to himself in the following days, helped with the fencing, taught Silas how to use a slingshot. He had a quiet charm, the kind men carry when they've lived through too much. But his eyes never stopped scanning the hills. One afternoon, Josie found him sitting near the fire pit, turning a small silver coin between his fingers. "You're not just here to say hello, are you?" she asked. He looked up, jaw tight. "I owed you one, and I needed a place to lay low. There's men in Laredo who don't forgive debts." Josie folded her arms. "So you brought trouble to my door." He nodded slowly. "I did, but I won't let it touch you. You have my word." Colt, watching from the porch, didn't say anything. But that night, he cleaned his rifle and made sure the lantern by the gate burned long past midnight. Something was coming, and the peace they had found might not last much longer. The morning arrived sharp and bitter, as if the land itself sensed what was coming. Josie stood on the porch, arms wrapped around herself despite the warmth of the coffee mug. Micah had saddled his horse before first light, and Colt was oiling the hinges on the barn door, a nervous habit that betrayed his calm face. "You don't have to stay," Josie said, eyes fixed on her brother. "I do," Micah answered simply. "They won't stop if I run. I brought them here. I'll see it finished." Colt stepped up beside them. "We do it together. We protect what's ours. Just after sunrise, they came. 3 riders, dust trailing behind them like smoke from a bad memory. They stopped outside the front gate. Colt, Micah, and Josie waited, armed and ready, but hearts thudding too loud to ignore. One of the men dismounted, lean, with a snake's grin and a revolver on each hip. "Micah Stone," he called. "Come to finish what you started?" Micah stepped forward. "You got your money, Reardon. You just want blood." Reardon smirked. "I always collect in blood." What followed was not a gunfight. It was a war in seconds. Shots cracked through the stillness. Colt hit the first rider off his horse. Josie, from the porch, fired her father's old shotgun, scattering a second's aim wide. But Reardon came straight for Micah. The two clashed near the corral. Fists, gun handles, dust, and rage. Until finally, Micah managed a twist, a roar, and Reardon went down hard. The quiet returned slowly, like breath after drowning. They buried the dead near the cottonwoods, far from the house. No words, just earth, and the memory of choices made. That night, Colt lit the porch lantern like always. Silas played with his toy horse beneath the table. Josie ran her fingers through his hair, her eyes still watching the horizon. Micah walked out to the barn, but not to leave. "I'll stay for a while," he said softly. "If you'll have me." Josie nodded. "This time you stay for good." Months passed. Fences were mended, seeds planted. Love rebuilt itself not in grand gestures, but in silent dinners, in shared work, in the way Colt would pull Josie close just because. Micah found his place too. Not as a runaway, but as an uncle, a brother, a man who chose redemption over flight. And Josie, once a woman buried alive by grief, was now rooted deeper than the land beneath her boots. What tried to bury her only made her rise stronger.